Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third pair updates. This evening, we're going to focus on the 2024 Canadian Championships and Paralympic trials selection and guidelines. And just before we get going, just a few housekeeping pieces. We ask that all questions that you might have wait till the end. If you are thinking about it and you want to pop it in the Q&A so you don't forget, you can do that as we go along, but we will wait until the end to answer the questions. And as we've done with previous webinars, we will stay on the subject that is presented today for questions. If something comes up around anything else and you want to ask the question, you can send a follow-up email to para@athletics.ca and we'll be happy to answer you that way. And that way we just keep the subject of the webinar really tight and people can be directed to webinars on specific subjects as we continue to do these. I will put all this information in the chat once we get going. And yeah, so questions in the Q&A, if we don't have time to answer them, because we do have quite a lot to cover today, we're going to have Simon Nathan joining us later to talk about some items as well. We will continue on. We can take your questions offline and we will make sure to answer them that way as well. So we will remind everyone of this at the end so it doesn't get lost as people join, but this will be our last Para Updates webinar for this spring season. And as we all get busy for the outdoor season, preparing for trials and for the Paralympic Games, we're going to regroup in the fall and start these again. So if there are any subjects or parts of the pathway or anything that you're interested in having a webinar on para-athletics, do let us know and we can incorporate that in our planning. So I'm going to pass it, or actually the next slide is mine, the first slide. So just quickly on, so today we're going to talk about Canadian Track and Field Championships, which are taking place in Montreal at the end of June. And so quickly, just a little bit of information on logistics. So if you are looking to book accommodation, you can book it through our HTG, which is our accommodation third party that's helping us with that. And if you are looking for wheelchair accessible rooms, we do ask you that you include those rooms and they will contact you directly to support you there. Travel, the Dorval airport is actually quite close to the tracks, about 30 minutes, so much closer than it was in Langley. And there is a map and a full address available on the event website, which I'll also put in the chat once I pass it on to Sarah. And then for transportation, so we do have a shuttle that will run through our partner hotels only and the venue. And right now we haven't fully finalized around the wheelchair accessibility, but the assumption is that they will be accessible for ambulatory athletes. And for those looking for a wheelchair accessible shuttle, we will have a van on demand. And there's also accessible parking that will be reserved for people that need it. So if you're planning on renting a car, then we will have some spots available. So I will also put a link in the chat on requesting accessible transportation and parking spots to help us plan like we've done in the past. So that's it just for logistics. Any questions can be directed to events@athletics.ca. And I'll just put that all in the chat. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Fanny. So I'm Sarah Black. I'm the Para Performance Manager with Athletics Canada, and I'll be reviewing the para event guidelines for the upcoming Canadian Championships, or also called the 2024 Bell Track and Field Trials. We've received a lot of feedback from previous championships over the years and consulted many athletes, coaches, officials, stakeholders, as well as other NSOs on these guidelines with the goal to balance inclusion and supporting the development of our sport while also providing competitive opportunities for athletes on or nearing the performance pathway, the ultimate goal of a Canadian Championships. The purpose of these guidelines is to support viable and meaningful competition for our para-athletes, giving them the opportunity to compete against their peers and creating full competitive event fields wherever possible. This may include combining sport classes or integrating with Olympic stream athletes. And then the objectives of these guidelines is to provide clarity and guidance to athletes, coaches, PTSOs, DSOs, officials, and our local organizing committees on event selection, athlete integration, how to seed athletes, how athletes will progress through event rounds, how final placings and medals will be determined, as well as requirements for national team selection, which High Performance Director Simon Nathan will cover near the end of the presentation here. So like all championships, athletes are required to meet the entry criteria for each event to be eligible to participate, including being a 2024 Athletics Canada member, which is done through your branch. There are no standards for para events. However, athletes do need to be nationally classified. The deadline to request physical impairment classification for this year's championships is May 10th, which is tomorrow. There are limited spots because there's been quite the demand, so make sure you get that in. And then if you're an II or VI athlete, please email classification@athletics.ca to determine if it's possible to get your national classification status prior to the championships. We often have foreign athletes participating in our championships if they're eligible for para-athletics. However, only Canadian citizens and permanent residents are eligible to win a Canadian Championship medal or be considered for national team selection. Para events at the 2024 Track and Field Trials or Canadian Championships will align with the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games program, with similar disciplines combined to create a paramedal event. So sport classes will be combined in four main categories: ambulatory throws, ambulatory track, seated throws, and wheelchair racing. And these categories will be represented at the championships and make up the paramedal events. So for example, it wouldn't be a men's F57 javelin, it's men's ambulatory javelin, which would include, F57 is a seated. 64 javelin would be combined with F11 javelin, for example. So all classifications eligible for ambulatory javelin will be combined. Same with, seated throws events, same with wheelchair racing events, and same with ambulatory track events, and so on and so forth. In order to increase competitive opportunities for developing athletes and build some depth within the sport as a whole, athletes can integrate into existing events as long as there's WPA points available. I'll be speaking in more detail about what WPA point scores are and how they're calculated in a few slides. But for example, there's no men's T34 400 meters in the Paralympic Games, but since there is a men's T54 400 meter, there will be a men's wheelchair 400 at the championships, so that T34 athlete could enter that event. Canadian Championship medals will be awarded to the top 3 finishers in each paramedal event. So for example, again, women's seated discus. If for avoidance of doubt, if there is a case where an event has fewer than 3 competitors, medals will still be awarded to each finisher in that top 3. An overview or how classifications are combined. So again, you'll see the sporting gender, the category, so either ambulatory, wheelchair, or seated, and then the event itself. There may be events that aren't viable if there's no registrants. So for example, there wasn't a club throw for either gender in last year's championship, but this is kind of the framework that we work from each year. So where multiple sport classes compete together, World Para Athletics, or WPA point scores, or also known as RASA, will be used to determine placings for the paramedal events. So RASA is a factor system that uses statistical modeling to map out trends for each event to compare performances across events, disciplines, and classifications. It takes into account the size of each class and the depth. The performance is based on that depth. And then there's a very complex formula that's designed so that these different athletes can be new world records, for example, has very little effect. So the world's best score is around 1,000 points. So the closer an athlete is to that score, the more competitive they are in the world. If a sport class isn't listed on the WPA point score calculator, an athlete won't be eligible to compete for that event at the championships. So for example, point scores don't exist in track events for sport classes 40 and 41. So short stature athletes, only field events or throws events are eligible for that sport class. So those athletes can only compete in eligible throwing events. This isn't a perfect system, but it creates the most equitable way to compare across classifications and event groups. So for example, when comparing a T51 and T54 athlete on the track on time alone, the T54 athlete is likely to be first past post based on the level of function versus being the more competitive athletes. So this is a way that we can try to mitigate function being the deciding factor on performance. We've utilized this system successfully for throws for a number of years, and then recently introduced it on the track side last year for the first time, and had a lot of positive feedback on that introduction. For track events, athletes will be combined with others of the same sporting gender based on that category, such as wheelchair or ambulatory. If there are rounds, athletes will be placed into the heat using a zigzag distribution. And then after the first round, athletes will be scored based on their WPA point scores. And then the relevant number of athletes will progress to the next round. It's important to note that T11 and T12 athletes are allocated 2 lanes, regardless of if they use a guide or not, which may influence the number of athletes who are in each heat or who progress through the rounds. And I'll show an example next. So here's an example of men's 400-meter ambulatory. This is the entry list with the seed times. And so there's 10 athletes plus 1 athlete that's T12 that may or may not use a guide, but is allocated 2 lanes. And so these athletes are going to be zigzag placed into 2 heats. And so you'll see these aren't ranked in performance, but the fastest 2 athletes will be in separate heats, and so on and so forth. And then once the athletes compete in the heat, they'll have their heat time, and those will be calculated into RASA points. Again, the closer an athlete is to 1,000 points, the more competitive they are in their class and in their field. So then those RASA scores are going to be ranked with the one closest to 1,000 points scored ranked first, and the one furthest away from 1,000 points will be ranked last. And then to progress to determine the qualifiers, because typically we have 8 athletes progressing to a final in a 400 meters. However, we need to allocate, because the T12 athlete is ranked in that realm of progressing to finals, we need to allocate them 2 lanes. And so there'll be 7 athletes progressing to the final. And you can see that little Q to represent each of those. So then we move on to the final. So we have the final times listed here. Those will also then be converted into RASA point scores, and then those will be ranked accordingly to get our championship rank and our para event medals. So again, the closest to 1,000 points would be ranked first and therefore be the recipient of the gold men's para ambulatory 400-meter final. In jumps and throws, athletes will be combined with others of the same sporting gender based on event category, such as ambulatory throws or ambulatory jumps or seated throws, and they will compete against one another with final placings determined by the WPA point score or RASA. In the instance where depth of field for ambulatory track or throws is not viable for a competitive experience, para-athletes may be integrated with Olympic stream athletes, so the same age category and sporting gender. And this integration may occur in qualifying rounds or finals, depending on the number of athletes in each event. Wherever possible, para-athletes will have a standalone event if more than 5 competitors are present. However, additional factors such as meet scheduling, entries, seed times, etc., will also be considered. If an event is integrated, para-athletes will be placed in the same heat or wave regardless of seed time or distance. And this is to ensure equitable opportunities for championship medals and national team selection. And then final ranks and medals will be awarded separately from the Olympic stream athletes based on the WPA or RASA score. When an event is integrated, it would be considered a para event from a national team selection standpoint. If a para medal event final is integrated within the qualifying round for a senior event, and the para athlete qualifies to progress to the next round, they are eligible to continue through the rounds, provided they meet any additional requirements. And then para-athletes may also choose to compete in additional Olympic stream events for which they are eligible, whether that's U20, senior, or the open qualifying rounds. And although these performances may be eligible for WPA and AC national para rankings and records, they won't be included in the final rank for the Canadian Championship para medal events, and therefore no medals would be awarded to those para athletes. So for an example, there's a separate 100-meter race for para ambulatory and the Olympic stream athletes at the Canadian Championships. So all para athletes seeking selection for the Paralympic Games in the women's 100-meter must compete in the women's ambulatory 100-meter event. That athlete may also choose to compete in the Olympic stream open 100 meters if they choose. However, their result in this event would not be eligible for para-specific medals and not be counted towards that first place Canadian athlete status for priority nomination for national team selection. Simon will be going into a little bit more detail on what priority nomination means. Integration example number 2. So this, we have a combined men's discus integrating both open athletes and para athletes at the championships. So again, all para athletes seeking selection in the Paralympics must compete in this event. However, different from the first scenario, these athletes will be eligible for para-specific medals and be eligible to be the first place Canadian athlete in their classification, for status of priority nomination. Okay, and in both of these scenarios, those athletes are eligible for the WPA results, rankings, and records as long as they meet all the other requirements. So before I pass it on to Simon, who will provide more in-depth information on national team selection at trials, I'm just going to check or give a minute to see if there's any questions about the para event guidelines. So I'll just give it a minute. You can type that in, and if it comes to you after, we can always circle back at the end. And I'll just add that the para event guidelines, there is a document that is published on our website, both under the trials webpage, as well as under the national team criteria for the Paralympic Games, which is under the high performance side of the website. So I don't see any questions popping through. Again, if any come up, we can circle back at the end. But for now, I will pass it over to Simon Nathan to talk about national team selection requirements at trials.
Sarah, before we continue, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that if you do have a question, it should be entered in the Q&A. The chat is disabled during a webinar. So if you have a question that you want to type, just we would want it in the Q&A. So we'll just give another maybe 30 seconds for anyone that wants to do that.
Thanks, Fanny. I'll give it a few seconds as well. Okay, Sarah, maybe we'll move on.
Sounds good. Over to you.
So thanks to Sarah for the introductory elements and description of the trials and how they'll work. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how athletes get picked for the Paralympic Games themselves. If you just want to go to the next point, Sarah. So I've gone into this in quite a lot of detail already in webinar 1. If you want to just review that, please go back and see that. I'm just going to give a quick overview here and give a chance for questions and just emphasize a few things I didn't emphasize in the first webinar. So this is a refresher, but with some additional new details. And as always with these things, they're quite formal. And if I say anything that's contradicted in the criteria, then the criteria always wins. I do a lot to try and make sure that I'm aligned, and then Sarah and Franny really keep me in my place and make sure I haven't gone too far off piste. But if there are any contradictions, then the criteria are what's most important. Next point, please. And hopefully I'll clarify some of the common questions we've had already. Next point, please. Okay, and again. So throughout this selection process, athletes are nominated in a ranking order. And we use the word nominated because this is CPC's team. It's not Athletics Canada's team. It's not anybody else's team. The Paralympics is CPC's team. The team includes all of the events of the Paralympics. Track and field is just one of the many sports there. So we nominate to CPC, and CPC themselves do the actual selection. Now, it's very rare, very, very rare that they do anything other than accept our nominations, but we have to be quite careful with the language, and that's why we use that word for this competition. But for the World Championships, we'll say selected. For this one, we'll just say nominated. And then the other thing that's important to understand is we have a team quota. So unlike the able-bodied World Championships, where we can send anybody that qualifies, up to 3 per event, for the Paralympic Games, World Para Athletics and IPC set us a team quota, certain number of males, certain number of females, and that's a maximum number of people that we can take. And the way to do that's fairly complicated. And again, I go over that a lot in webinar 1. I'll just give a refresher here. Next point, please. Sometimes so the ranking order is based on the statistics on the IPC website. There's a World Para-Athletics ranking specifically for the Paralympic Games, and so Nate Reich is the world #1 1500 meter runner, so he's ranked #1. And then someone's ranked #2, someone's ranked #3, someone's ranked #4 in that event. So we'll compare Nate to all people ranked #1, whatever their event is. If Greg Stewart's also ranked #1 and Brett Lacato's is also ranked #1, then we have 3 people. So a tie for first place, and then we'll look at all the people ranked second, other people ranked third, and so on. We'll keep going down as taking people in nomination order. At the very last place, if we have 2 or 3 or more athletes who have the same world ranking, we call that a tie. And then that's when the selection panel come in. And the selection panel will have to split out between those 2, 3, 4 people, however many it is, and put them in order. And what they'll do is they'll put them in the order that they think those athletes will finish in Paris. It's not an exact science. There's all sorts of things that they'll take into account, including performances during the year, past performances, demonstrating that they've performed on demand in the past, demonstrated they've been able to do well at the trials or at the previous World Championships or Paralympic Games if they've competed at those levels. So the selection panel will go through that process and break the tie. Next, please. Those nominated athletes will then be published in a list. People may or may not appeal the decisions that were taken, particularly if they're around a tie, or if they think that the result was missing and not taken into account or something like that. So any appeals are gone through, and once all the appeals are done, then we send that final list to CPC, and they'll formally select the athletes, and they'll be announced and added to the team and send a uniform and all those good things. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So the first group that we're going to select will be the athletes who hold a trial standard, and in each classification group, we publish trial standards. So all the athletes with a trial standard who actually place first place at the trials in that event, they're the priority group. So that's when we say priority nominations, that group will be first, and we'll consider them before anybody else. Again, we'll take all those athletes, however many there are, we'll put them in a ranking order based on their world rankings, and we'll keep selecting all those, and if that fills up the entire team quota, we stop at that point. Most likely it won't, and then we'll go to the second group, and that's all of the remaining athletes who hold an AC MES, and again, you'll find those numbers in the criteria, and regardless of which event they're in, we'll rank all those remaining athletes by the MES, pick them in order, and most likely with somewhere within that group will have used up our team quota. And once the team quota is done, then we're finished. If it works out that we have more team quota to give, then we'll go to the third and final group, which are just athletes that have the World Para-Athletics minimum entry standard, World Para-Athletics MES. And again, we'll rank them by world ranking order, take them down until we've filled up the team quota. And it's when I'm saying world ranking list, what I mean is the WPA Paris 2024 Paralympic Games MES minimum entry standards rankings. It's a big mouthful, but that's how you find it on the IPC website, and you drop down so all sorts of variations of ranking lists, and that's a particular one that we'll use. And you'll see that published regularly, updated and published regularly on the AC website as well, so you can pick that and see how people are ranked any one particular week. But the only ranking that really counts is the ranking the day after the end of the qualification period. The rest is just for information. Obviously, in some events and some classifications, people can qualify in multiple races. So if you're a T53, you've got a T53 100 meters, I think 200 or 400 meters, and then combined with T54 800, 1500 and 5000 and the marathon. Whichever of those events that you're highest in, then you'll be considered against that one event. Or if you're a shot putter and you only have one event that you qualified for, that's one that we use. But we'll take the one that for each individual athlete puts them the highest up the possible ranking, and that's how we'll order people. Thanks, Darren. So the important piece, or a massively important piece of this, is the quota slots. How many quota slots do we have? Just go forwards from there. We've got 3 ways of earning quota slots. Any athlete who finished top 4 at the Paris World Championships in 2023 earns a quota slot. Now, they earn a quota slot, and that athlete, that person, can never earn another quota slot anywhere else in this process. So again, Amanda Rummery was 4th in the 400 meters in World Championships in Paris. So she's earned a quota slot, and whatever else she does, she can't earn an additional quota slot. The strange thing is that quota slot doesn't belong to her. That quota slot is for a female athlete to represent Athletics Canada and to represent the Canadian Paralympic Committee at the Paralympic Games. So obviously, Amanda wants to take that slot, but it could be anybody that fills that slot. The next way of us earning quota slots is for any athlete to finish top 2 in Kobe. Now, again, to take Amanda, if Amanda had gone to Kobe, doesn't matter where she finished, 1st, 2nd, 5th, 6th, 7th, she can't earn another quota slot. So we've only sent athletes to Kobe who haven't yet earned a quota slot, and the ones that we think are most likely to finish in the top 2 there. If somebody in Kobe, suppose we sent Nate Reich to Kobe, and and Nate finished 1st, only the 2nd place person can earn a quota slot for their country. It's not 2 people in Kobe who haven't yet earned a quota slot. Only the first 2 can earn a quota slot, and if they've already earned it, they don't earn a second one, and it doesn't sort of roll down to anywhere else. So those are the World Championships routes in. And then the 3rd route, World Athletics or World Parathletics look at all the Canadian athletes who've got past the high performance standard, their published high performance standard, and they count how many of those people there are who haven't earned a quota slot but have got over that level. And they use this number in a big formula compared to every other country, and they use that number to figure out how many additional quota slots we get. So I think typically it works out that every 3 or 4 Canadians who get a high performance slot earn 1 more slot for the team. So the more athletes across more events that we get, they get high performance standards, the more quota slots we'll get, but it won't be anywhere near as many quota slots as there are high ranking athletes. It's an unusual system, but that's how it works. And if people want worked examples, want to know more, then email us separately, we can help. As I've said a few times, World Parathletics have a separate quota for male and female teams. Currently, we're estimating a total of 20 athletes on the team for Paris, which is great because we only had 16 in Tokyo, so it's a bigger team than we had at the last Paralympics. On the other hand, it's 5 less than the number of athletes we actually had go to the Paris World Championships. And that was an incredibly strong team. So competition for those 20 places are going to be very, very tough. And there's not much we can do about that other than do everything we can to try and make the quota bigger. Next. So we have Canadian Tire, who do lots of statistics for us, are currently estimating the number of athletes we have generating a quota. You can see at the moment, when I say 20 athletes, they're estimating 19 to 21 athletes for us. It's this line here, pinks for girls, blues for boys, very traditional. And next slide. These are the athletes who have contributed to this, and it's how they go. So on the men's side, so the column on the left, we had 6 athletes who already finished top 4 at the Para Worlds. And again, Austin Smank or Brent Lakatos or whatever, they finished top 4 more than once, but they only generate 1 slot each. And then the lower part of that, 4.2, obviously we can't take 4.2 athletes, but that's based on how many male athletes we have who've achieved the high performance standard. They're all listed on the right, based on the current state of all the athletes all around the world, Canadian Tire have done an estimate, and they think that number of para men will generate us 4 slots. So depending on how the 0.2 goes, and depending on if we get a few more and how other countries go in Kobe, that might end up being 4 slots or maybe 5 slots. So our estimate is 10 to 11 men. And on the women's side, we only had 4 athletes only. It's a great performance for us. We only had 4 athletes finish top 4 in Paris, but we have more female athletes with the high performance standard compared to the rest of the world. And we think that they'll generate another 5 and a bit slots. And again, depending on how the bit goes and how other countries finally finish up, we think that will cause us 9 to 10 slots. What will help us to increase those numbers? So again, these are the 6 athletes we've selected to go to Kobe. What will help to increase these numbers dramatically is as many of those athletes finishing in the top 2 as possible. So that will all boost up the red part of that, the automatic part of the quota that won't go away. It will also, although it will take away a little bit of the numbers of athletes contributing to the green, it'll only take 1 athlete out, and that will only change slowly. So that's our best way, just mathematically, of increasing the total quota. The other thing that will help is more and more athletes achieving high performance standards, and increasing our total pool as well. What we won't know is until the final date, which I think is on the next slide. Is that right? I'm just trying to remember. Can you remember the final date, Sarah?
For the
team quota to be finalized, I think it's July 28th from memory.
June 28th.
June 28th.
On or after.
On or after. So if you go back to that previous slide, sorry. So at the moment, this is an estimation, and it will depend on how many athletes are licensed with World Athletics and performance standards, exactly what happens in Kobe and whatever. But on or around June the 28th, World Para Athletics will finalize the quota for Canada. They'll send us a formal letter inviting us to send that number of athletes, and then things can't change, and that's then set in stone. And we'll obviously publish that number, and we'll know exactly our quota of male and female athletes. The only restriction we'd have after that point is everyone we put into that quota must have achieved a World Para Athletics minimum entry standard, but we've got way more athletes that have done that than a likely quota. So we will absolutely fill up our quota as far as we can. Okay, next slide, please. So going back to the Canadian Championships, para athletes must compete in at least one para event at that championships to be eligible for the nomination. The only exceptions to that is if you have an injury or an illness or something that means it's not reasonable for you to compete, in which case you need a medical exemption from our Chief Medical Officer. That's Paddy, Dr. Paddy, and if that's your situation, then please contact Dr. Paddy immediately. If you know about that now, or contact Sarah or Carla, Fanny, anyone like that, will be able to put you in contact with Paddy. Most of the time, this is for people who are actually injured in the week of the championships. Even if you get into the blocks to start your race and you cramp up and you can't finish the race, you can still get a medical exemption right up to the last minute. But these things have to be real, and you have to be a reason for you not to compete at all, and not just you've got the snuffles and don't feel very well. A full medical exemption. So that exists, and you should be aware of that. And please, if you're in that situation, deal with it sooner rather than later, whenever an injury might happen. Next point, please. So obviously, as many athletes as the way to get into the team, to take it out to the controllers selectors is to have that priority nomination, because that's the first group that's going to be picked to the Paralympics. So if you have that trials standard and you win the trials, you're in that group. We're going to give that to the first place Canadian athlete. That's the first place person eligible to represent Canada in that combination at the Paralympic Games. In each race, there's only going to be one gold medal winner. But for some of the combinations that Sarah's previously explained, there could be several different medal events, Paralympic medal events there. And it's the first Canadian across the line in each of the medal events who'll have that status. So even if we combine up higher classifications with lower classifications and someone comes in third, but they're the only one holding the trials classification and they're the first athlete in their medal event, Paralympic medal event across the line, that's the person that will get the priority nomination. I hope that makes sense. If not, then please just ask questions. The other point is, it's really important to understand, that trial standard, you have to have achieved it within the qualification period and before the trials, or actually in the race at the trials itself. Any of those things will work. What you can't do is if you finish first and then rush off and find another competition the next day somewhere else, like a club event in Kamloops or a little trials event in Ottawa or something, and then get the higher standard, that's too late. Your trials final has finished, and that's your last opportunity to get the trials standard. So again, it's really important to understand, and if that's not clear to anybody, then please ask us questions. In short, you need to get the trials standard before the trials itself or at the trials itself and finish first, and then you're in that priority group. And athletes that have that medical exemption, they can't win their trials event because they're not going to compete, so they will not be in that priority group. So again, if you have the snuffles, that's not going to help you because you're not going to get into the priority group. Get out on the track, do your best, and try and be the first in your medal event to get into that group. Once we get to the second group, we can take account of all these exemptions and all these other pieces, but only people who compete at the trials in their event will get into that priority group. Okay, next point, please. Any questions for me? I can see there's some stuff in the chat. I think that's from our end. If you do have questions, please type them in, but don't be wondering if you're shy to ask here or you don't quite know how to put the question together. Ask me. If you're on CAP, ask your APA, ask Carla, ask Sarah. Any of us will be able to answer. And it's much better to know exactly what you need and exactly what's expected of you well before the trials, and not to find out after the selection meetings happened and you're a bit surprised about the way things worked out. Again, what I haven't listed here is all the other eligibility things you have to do, be a current member, complete all of the CPC paperwork and the AC paperwork. Unfortunately, the Olympics and the Paralympics come with mountains of compliance and paperwork and things you have to do. But they will be very clearly communicated to you. Just make sure that they happen. And if something about your impairment means they're not easy to do for you, again, contact any of the people I just mentioned before, and that will help you to work your way through that. I'm not seeing any questions here, Sarah, so I will hand back to you.
I just want to allow, Simon, sorry, if people can either put them in the Q&A, or I see that Fiona has her hand raised, so we definitely want to make sure that questions are accessible. So if someone would prefer to ask the question aloud, we will unmute you to be able to ask questions. So I'll do that right now with Fiona. You're unmuted, Fiona.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, I apologize. I'm having a migraine and I was not able to process that last slide. So my question might have been answered by that last slide. So here's my question. I saw from the last year's results that in the T20 track events, there were only maybe 4 competitors in each of the races, each of the events. And I was wondering how come there's so few athletes that compete? Is it because these are the top tier athletes, and maybe there's a second tier, like they're the second fastest, but they are, well, they know that they're not as fast as these top tiers, so then they don't register.
I'll answer that, Fanny. Thanks for your question, Fiona. I think each athlete has their own reasons for competing or not competing. There are many real and perceived barriers to competing at a Canadian Championships, whether that's, you know, cost or personal goals of what they want to do within their sport. You know, scheduling if they have work or school or family commitments. So it's a very complex, there's not a specific answer to your very complex situation. What we are trying to do is increase the opportunities for athletes to have meaningful competition. And so, although on the Olympic side, there are standards to compete at the Canadian Championships, we have not implemented standards on the para side to allow for growth and development of all of our para athletes and disciplines. On the T20 side, specifically, T20 and F20 was reintroduced as recently as 2012 in the Paralympic cycle. And so it's a newer classification and newer event. So that could be why we often see maybe less athletes competing as a T or F20. However, we are seeing incredible growth in that classification, and those numbers are increasing year on year. So we hope that those athletes will take the opportunity to compete at the Canadian Championships this year. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, what I would just add to that is that there were two parts to the webinar today. So there was the Canadian Championships section, which talked about how the events would be run and how the guidelines come into play, how we're going to use the WPA point calculator to put sport classes together and give them a ranking. And then there was the Paralympic trials piece. So I think one of your questions was, is it only the best in Canada that come on the para side? It's like Sarah said, it's much open. We have a record number of athletes that are requesting to be classified at this year's Canadian Championships, which means that we're going to have a lot of new athletes, and where it always depends from year to year where that growth is happening, whether it's in the T20 or T34 or T67. It really depends on year to year. And then I think, BC was far for a lot of people. And so I think that Montreal, Ottawa over the next few years are just a little bit more central, and we'll see our numbers being much larger.
And I'll just add one final bit to that from my point of view, and it's sort of implied by what's just been said by Sarah and Franny, who gave excellent answers. But just to be clear, Athletics Canada doesn't set a quota that says only 4 athletes in the T20 event or any other event. We're looking to expand the whole para side of the sport as far as we can. So yeah, it's a number of athletes who have decided to come. The reasons why they may or may not have come in the past is already been explained.
Great, thank you very much.
Great, thanks for your question, Fiona. If there's anybody else that would prefer to ask their question, please raise your hand. You can also use the Q&A function if you'd rather do it in an offline perspective. Sarah's just put that up there at para@athletics.ca.
And if you did miss them, I do encourage you to look at the recordings from the previous webinars. So we did one on the Paralympic criteria in, I believe, January, which you can find on the high performance side of the website under national team criteria. And then we had 2 specific to para grassroots and development, the classification pathway. So the introduction of provisional, national, and international classification, the requirements for each and when an athlete should pursue each, as well as the para-athletics pathways specific to our development pathways. So bridging that gap between grassroots and high performance, and how we look to identify up and coming development athletes. All right, Fanny, I think we're good for questions. I'll pass it back to you for closing remarks.
Thanks so much to Sarah and Simon for joining us today. Simon in particular, Sarah is always here with me. So I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I think most of you know me. So my name is Fanny Smith and I'm the Para Development Manager. So Sarah and I work in tandem in trying to, increase opportunities for para athletes in Canada, and to just, make sure that information is clear and available, and that we continue to share and grow and do this all together. So we're very passionate about the growth, and hope that we can help you along the way. So para@athletics.ca is the best one to remember. It's easy and short, and you can reach us at any time. Just a reminder that we will pause the para updates until the end of the outdoor season and the Paralympic Games. And so we'll return sometime in October with some more para updates for you. So if you have any specific requests on subjects, please send us a note. And we'll remain the Q&A open for just another minute. And otherwise, have a good evening. And we will see you in Montreal, if not next time on the webinar.